Assalamu alaikum. Kiara koto katoa. It is my privilege to welcome you to this CARE conversation in this month of Ramadan. Let me begin by wishing you peace and harmony in this month of Ramadan. CARE is honored to have this conversation hosted by CARE's associate member, Dr. Fatima Junaid, and she will be facilitating a conversation with two community leaders, Tayyaba Khan and Anthony Green. Welcome, Fatima.
Thank you very much, Mohan and CARE, for providing us this space to have this conversation. As the month of Ramadan is ending, we all thought that it's important to talk about the cognitive resonance that Muslims are feeling within New Zealand but elsewhere as we open our fasts and think about Eid. We can't not think about the genocide that's happening in Palestine. And as we reflect on that, we have community leaders who have graciously given us time to talk about these issues. We have Tayyaba Khan and Anthony Green. Tayyaba is the founder and trustee of Khadija Leadership Network, the New Zealand Peace Ambassador for European Muslim League, former Director of Advocacy at the Office of Health and Disability Commissioner, and a community development practitioner with over 15 years of experience, having worked with migrant and refugee communities in the occupied territories of Palestine, Australia, United Kingdom, and New Zealand. Tayyaba currently sits on the governance boards of Mixit and Belong Aotearoa. We also have Anthony Green, who is originally from the UK. He's worked as a teacher of English and literature, first in the UK and then for 18 years in Singapore. In the 6 months period of the mosque attacks and on the 5-year anniversary, he served as a spokesperson for Muslim Association of Canterbury. His writings include books commissioned by Majalis Ugma Islam Singapore, Singapore's Islamic Council, dealing with all aspects of development and work of that body, its history, mosque building program, Hajj organization, and more. His own work includes a history of how people traveled by sea from Southeast Asia to journey to Makkah for the Hajj. His interest in the people's story, particularly those who are unsung, what the poet Brian Patton called the loose change history spent without caring. Thank you so much to the both of you for being here. I struggle in relation to how to open up this conversation in relation to how we all are feeling at the moment. But I think the more important question is that what is it that we should, or we can possibly do considering what is happening around us?
Tēnā koutou katoa. Assalamu alaikum. I first would like to sort of just disabuse myself about the title community leader. I don't claim anything. I'm a sort of a community presence, and force of circumstance put me in a certain place after March 15. But I don't claim to be a leader in a sense. So in that sense, I'm speaking just as an individual, a concerned individual. I did ask Fatima, could this conversation be seen as a kind of an indulgence? Who are these people so far away speaking about this thing? Because the opening talked about solidarity and dissonance, and feeling. And then you come to impotence and the tremendous impotence. What do you do when something is going on so far away, has reached this state of tremendous destruction, and it's so split? So then the questions are, well, okay, who are you talking to? And we have two communities with very, very different narratives about the same space. and each one in a state of great hurt, and saying, how dare people speak to this without seeing my hurt? So it's a very it's a difficult thing. The idea of dissonance, when we break fast and we're coming right to the end of our fasting month of Ramadan, there is that moment, I was reflecting on this, where you break fast simply, and it can be just a sip of water. And there's a lovely feeling when you just take a sip of water and it just goes down to your throat. And I thought of this the other day, and you know what happens in Gaza when they have nothing. And I can sense that there'll be people there say, how can you talk about this when you don't talk about the 7th of October? So we have one community for whom everything began, as far as this is concerned, with the 7th of October last year. And we have another community for whom everything began in 1948. And so these two strands saying, you cannot talk to this without first saying this. And it's something of the problem we have with the very binary way of seeing issues. After 9/11, George W. Bush said, either you're for us or against us. I have heard Boris Johnson say something like, to demand a ceasefire is to basically concede everything to Hamas. This conversation is not intended to be about the politics of this. It's to try to say, what can we do as distant individuals? But when you have this, I'll mention a number of books, possibly in the course of this, but Ami Ayalon was the head of the Israeli Navy, highly honored. He then became the head of Shin Bet, the internal security service of Israel. And there was a moment in his book, Friendly Fire, there's a moment where he talks about 1982, where he's in the US and there's been an attempt on assassination on the Israeli ambassador in London, and he's talking to the head of the Norwegian submarine force, who can't quite understand where he's coming from. And Ayalon says to him, you must understand, you count differently from we do. If you count your dead, you go 1, 2, 3, you count them on one hand. He said, we begin with 6 million. So okay, part of the challenge is to get into the head of the other, but okay, so that sits there, but as I say, part of this, a big aim of this conversation is, okay, fine, these distant things, these abstract things are there. What can we do about this situation? And if we can do nothing about this situation, we cannot go out and stop the killing. We don't have that power. What can we do to recognize, how do things come to this state where in this case it's Israel and Palestinians, but it could be anywhere else in the world, where any one community looks at another and speaks of them in terms that are denigrating, dehumanizing, and that's a human failing, which drags down the individual who utters those words, whoever they be. And I remind myself, it could be Muslims who speak in that way. So what are the spaces we can talk to about what we could or can do? And I'd like to talk to that when Tayyaba said something, has spoken, because I'm looking at, really, I'm almost coming back to one word which began the whole revelation of the book that we turn to, the word Iqra, read and recite. And obviously that's a very, very different, hugely, profound dimension. But what are we reading? What are we exploring? What are the voices we listen to as we try to see where we've come to and how we can move to a better place?
Kia ora. Auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Kia ora Etifano. Firstly, I just want to start off with saying thank you, Dr. Fatima and Care, for creating this opportunity for us to have a conversation. I've just realized that I've gone through a whole Ramadan where it is actually a privilege to be able to not organize something for a change and participate in something that someone else has organized, and to reflect. Reflection is really becoming a privilege these days with the chaos that is going on around us. So look, how I come to this conversation is really from a very personal perspective, and I tautoko what Brother Anthony said about community leaders. I also don't espouse to that title. I find it quite problematic. It immediately puts us in a place where we represent, a whole raft of people, and we don't live in that world, unfortunately. So, so there is a problem with the title, but I definitely come from a place where I like to think that I have been given the divine sort of purpose to serve our communities collectively, and that's not just Muslim community, but communities at large. And that is what I do, and that's the intention with which I come to this conversation. What can we do, and what has been happening? And so I guess I want to take it down to a very personal level, because there's a lot of information floating around. We're operating in an era where information is easily accessible. Not all of it is accurate. And when we're in that kind of an environment, I like to think it boils down to personal stories that can help you figure out your own personal story and map and journey. And mine starts from when I went to Palestine for the very first time, and the West Bank. And the year was 2009. Gaza was actually being bombed then. And as a young person, I was more interested in really understanding what was happening on the ground, because so far removed from that geographical location and that land, you're hearing from the media the narrative that they want to shape for you in your mind and in your heart around what is the reality and who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. And so I really wanted to go in with a very sort of open mind and figure out, well, okay, why are the Israelis, occupying this land? Why are they bombing Palestinians? What do I feel about that as a Muslim, as someone who's born in Pakistan but has never really grown up there, and lived in other parts of the world? I'm a product of the West, so my Islam comes from an understanding of a Western framework, which alhamdulillah, actually, when you think about it now, is a privilege, because it's not imposed on you, it's a choice you make. And I think as Muslims, some of us really recognize that, that when you have the choice to learn your faith, that's very different to when your faith is enforced on you. So you see the world very differently as a result of that. Anyway, a culmination of those things, being a product of the post 9/11 young person, I decided to go to the West Bank, much to my parents' dismay. It is a massive cultural shock, not really meeting the expectations of being a Muslim young woman when you pack up your bags and you go somewhere that is very, very dangerous. So I spent the first 3 months in the West Bank with an organization called the International Women's Peace Service. That is a movement of people from around the world, women who go to the West Bank to be witnesses to the human rights abuses that are happening on the ground. And really you volunteer to be of service as and when you can, but you are making human rights reports, essentially, and witnessing the violations that are happening. So for someone like me, who was a young person who's protested here in the safe environment of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and has no idea what violence could look like, I ended up in Jerusalem when Sheikh Jarrah was first actually starting to be occupied by settlers. So Sheikh Jarrah is East Jerusalem. And my very first day as I landed in Jerusalem, the team who I was with said, okay, well, we're going to Sheikh Jarrah. We believe a house is actually being occupied today. And so your job is to hold this camera and actually record what's going to happen. And I had no idea what I had signed myself up to. I'll be really, really honest. I was like, that doesn't sound too difficult, holding a camera and making some recording. And literally within a matter of seconds, violence erupted to a point that I had never experienced in my life. And I watched a group of people literally physically pull out the Palestinians who were in their homes and shove them out. The IOF, the Israeli Occupation Force, supported that process. And you had a group of people who didn't live in that house go into that house and put their flag up and occupy it. And the people that were living in that house were now outside their own home, sitting on the footpath. And a tent was built for them. And that is where they stayed for at least a week that I was with the team, trying to kind of report on this very first home that was occupied on one strip of the street. That is my very first day in Jerusalem with the International Women's Peace Service. So look, as much as I acknowledge the hurt that the hostages on the Israeli side are feeling as a result of October 7th, I also want to acknowledge the 75 plus years of history of occupation of the Palestinian land, and the hurt that we are seeing generationally of a people who are dispersed across the globe. And it's with that vein that I want to talk about this, because if we're going to talk about colonization, if we're going to accept the concept of colonization in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and want to educate ourselves and want to decolonize our mind, then we need to look at it in a global way as well. We can't just think, oh, we accept the colonization and how it happened here, but we do not want to accept the colonization and how it happened somewhere else. These issues are interlinked. Sudan, Congo, Palestine, the world is essentially on fire for us right now. And these issues are not disconnected. They're actually deeply connected to how power has been misused in terms of how we've been treating people. So what can we do, which is the question you asked, Dr. Fatima. And I think I want to go back to, we can start with ourselves. We can really start with decolonizing our mind. And I go back to one of our faith principles that I think is becoming more and more important for me as I age, which is being consistent. Where I think I want this here, I equally want that here. If I think I want something good for myself, I equally want that for someone else. And stop being hypocritical in terms of how we apply our lenses to the same situation just because it has someone else involved. So we're okay with our own privileges as long as they don't affect us. But the moment that's at threat, the rules change. I think that's the bit we need to work on. And we need to change within ourselves before we can actually tackle the bigger problems that are out there. So I think my starting point would be the self. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that you guys can carry on talking about it, but when you say about self and how Anthony was talking about, Ikra and reading, that's also related to self. But there is a lot of fear that people feel when they want to be consistent. That's also dissonance. When they want to support, but they feel afraid of many things, of hate aimed at them, of actual consequences in terms of work or opportunities, or for their or hate towards targeted towards their families or their children. So just putting that part out there, that I understand that we should but how do you deal with it, or how do you suggest, or have you ever dealt with it? Or so that would be my question. You don't have to answer it now or even later, but I just had that thought, so I thought I'll put it forward to you guys. And but over to you both.
That starting with self. You begin with. I'm in a curious situation. I'm a white guy, clearly. I speak with a British accent. Clearly, I'm stuck with that. Apparently, you have to leave a country before the age of about 15, otherwise you're stuck with the accent. So I come from the country that drew the lines on the map, really. And I attended a function, I think it was last year, but goodness me, time goes very quickly. And it was a function down here in Christchurch. A lot of the families who'd experienced loss, and so this was a barbecue. And I was talking to people there, and then I left a little early. And as I was driving away, I realized that every single person of the 50 plus people, 50, 60, I can't remember how many people who were there, almost every single person came from a country where there had been sort of civil war or explosions or bombings or invasions, and or where the lines of the country were drawn by a foreign power. And I was the one who came from the country that drew the lines: Britain, France, other colonial countries. Now I can't carry any guilt for that. It's a curious thing. I looked up Lord Balfour, who was responsible for a lot of this terrible map of the Middle East, and apparently he died about a place about 10 kilometers from where I live, but a good deal earlier. That's totally irrelevant. But the point is that I speak from, and we can use this word, a privileged position with regard to this. So if we're talking about, and if I walk down the street, unless people have made some sort of connection, I'm not visibly other. So, I do not have the difficulty that a Muslim woman has wearing a hijab, or a person with darker colored skin. So, but okay, be that as it may, I have to work with where I am. We begin with ourselves. What is your circle of influence? It starts from yourself. One of the things that I keep coming back to is the appropriation of language. When other people tell a story about you, the late Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer, was writing about colonization, if I can remember the quote, and he said, "No foreigner can tell my story for me, no matter how talented or knowledgeable. Stories are not innocent. They can be used to put you in the wrong crowd, in the party of the man who has come to dispossess you, who with determined earnestness lays a claim to your territory, then carves out a space for you and wants you to be content with that slice of life." And we have that as Muslims, and other communities have that. There is a veritable machine, in particular in the USA, which demonizes Muslims. One prominent religious teacher said that Islam is a hate-filled ideology bent on world domination. I don't know anyone in the Muslim community who lives with hate. Nobody. And yet we have a situation where after the 15th of March down here in Christchurch, one of our community was outside the hospital. 3 ladies came along, 2 hugged her, and a third said, "I thought you people hated us." Well, that's strong. That's very, very strong. And that's global, because then that gets applied. So you have a situation where people think in a very binary fashion. George W. Bush, who said after 9/11, "Are you for us or against us? It's either that or that." So you can't say, do you condemn 9/11? So you can't say, "I condemn 9/11, but," because the but is a qualifier. It means that this person's holding back. They're not really there 100%. So it's a case of conjunctions. I condemn 9/11 and there must be that ability in conversations. And Daniel Levy, a former an Israeli involved with peace negotiations, has said you must be able to hold two different thoughts in your head at the same time. So you are in a position where, yes, what Hamas did in October last year is to be condemned. You do not, if you listen to somebody like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in the USA, he would say very, very clearly, Islam condemns the killing of innocent men, women, and children. You do not do that. And yet, if you read something, I've just read a book called The First Way of War in the USA, in North America, War on the Frontier, where you killed the innocent, the non-combatants, and you destroyed their land. So we can't be precious about our own way and says we never do this, but these people we can demonize because this is what they do. So, okay, there must be the readiness to hold these two different things. Then you come back to something about if you take Rabbi Hillel the Elder and the famous quotes from him, where he said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to another." We are a long way from that. We're a long way from that. So some of this, one part of this about what we can do is to start reading very, very differently. So you take somebody like, if I can find this, Ami Ayalon, who I mentioned, one of the former heads of Shin Bet, who has said that he started off, he was from the kibbutz, he was is a proud Israeli, staunch in the support of what it does. And then through working through what he did, he came to different positions. And he says that those who want victory against terror without addressing underlying grievances want an unending war. And you take to, maybe I'll make this my last little one for the moment, a documentary like the documentary The Gatekeepers, which was a co-production part of that is made in Israel, where 6 former heads of Shin Bet, the intelligence service, were interviewed about their experiences. And these are people who have given the instruction to blow people up, for goodness sake. One of them, the late Avraham Shalom, hard man, no soft touch. He looked at some of the uncompromising decisions he'd taken, but then he said, there is no alternative to talking. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, everyone, even Ahmadinejad, who was then the Iranian president, he said, whoever, I'm always for it. It's a trait of a professional intelligence operative to talk to everyone. Things get clarified. I see that you don't eat glass. He sees I don't drink petrol. That's how it is. I suggest people look at, I think it's available on online streaming, The Gatekeepers. It's available in some libraries. But start listening to people who have crossed the lines, who have seen the other side and seen the humanity in the other. And it doesn't, so to see what happened, an explanation is not a justification. If somebody does wrong, because we have that teaching in Islam, stand up for justice, even against yourselves and your own kin. Justice is paramount. That's what we've got. And if people do wrong and they're Muslims, then the wrongness is to be condemned. But it is not licensed. So I'm saying that I condemn this, and your conjunction is important, what you say. So the way that you couch things, but also the stories we learn about ourselves. And we could say a lot more about how our terms and how our frames of reference have been appropriated, and our terms like even a term like jihad, a term like the Sharia, has been appropriated and made to represent something other than what our traditional way would teach.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Anthony. And look, I think I don't know if I heard you clearly, but I'll just speak I suppose, my perspective around particularly the resistance, though that is not a part of our conversation today. But I think the example you've used very, very articulately exemplifies the level of Islamophobia that we find in society now, right? The expectation that we condemn something first before we expect to see the humanization in us. And I don't think that that is the world that we would want. So whilst I did say that, we recognize that there is hurt on the other side, and you qualified this as well, but there has been a history of occupation, of violence, of dehumanization, of imprisoning people, actually taking hostages on the Palestinian side for decades. We are talking about both sides having to learn to condemn, but we do not ask the other side to do that. And that is racism. That is a level of Islamophobia that we now need to undo. It is part and parcel of what's happened in terms of the 9/11 era, the way the media sort of created a narrative about Muslims, the way that Hollywood creates a narrative about Arabs and Muslims, and hence the way we now see ourselves and the internalized racism that exists within us, so that, where we think hatred is all around us. So this goes back to my point of answering your question, Dr. Fatima, the fear of hate. That fear of hate exists because a seed has been planted through these very narratives, through the way that we've actually had this propaganda built around us, that we just immediately think, I'm in danger. I'm always in danger. My job's in danger. My family's in danger. My ability to speak will mean I'm in danger. And that is a real danger, but it exists because we've always allowed for someone else to create a narrative that dehumanizes us as a collective. So I think whilst we want to condemn October 7th, we also now want to ask, could you please condemn the years of violence that has actually been happening? And let's get to that equilibrium. And one would be a little less fearful of the hate that exists in the world.
But I also want to continue putting the thoughts that you both were talking about in terms of narratives and picking up on the words jihad and Sharia, which, to be honest, even if I have to put something, will have to think multiple times. Can I use the word jihad, even though I know that the jihad that we do within us is so different? When we talking about ourselves, starting with ourselves, and that internalization of the narrative and of Islamophobia, actually, of the racism, I would really want you to talk about it, because in this time, when we talk about solidarity, we can't not think about all the factors associated with this narrative or language being taken away, or meanings being taken away, or you know what I mean? You know what I'm trying to, yeah. So would you like to comment on that? Yeah.
You don't mind, Brother Anthony, if I jump in first this time. Look, I think it is a shame, right? Because this is a part and parcel of the same problem, the hijacking of our spiritually conceptualized narratives that have actually now been misinterpreted as a result of the war on terror, as a result of the ongoing Islamophobia, which sadly a lot of the Muslim community themselves don't understand. So we've got a lot of work to do to empower our own people. We've got a lot of work to do to decolonize the minds of our own people, because Islam has actually inherited a level of diversity. And I'm going to boast a little here, but we do that in the interfaith sector when it comes to us, freely and frankly talking about our theology. But Islam is the religion that said we're all equal, irrespective of our race, color, and so forth and so forth. And that was beautifully exemplified in the way Bilal radiallahu anha was given, so a black slave was given the responsibility to call the adhan, a really important part of calling people to prayer. That symbolism for us as Muslims is really important. Do we talk about it? No. And do we understand it? Unfortunately, we haven't actually spent enough time to understand the importance of our diversity is such a huge part of our faith and our kete. So in that same spirit, when it comes to Islamophobia, in reverse, when you have actually had mainstream narratives tell you, oh, you guys blow up places, oh, jihad means, you guys go and create violence left, right, and center. We haven't even fact-checked ourselves whether that narrative is actually accurate. And we haven't actually stopped and said, hey, that is an inaccurate representation of what you think we are. Because it's a siege, right? So how much of the fight will you actually be fighting? So Islamophobia has actually become an ingrained part of our society now, where it's prolifically everywhere. There's a point in my life when I was growing up here, when I was younger, and I would say, New Zealand doesn't have racism. I deeply regret that I said that as a young person, because what I didn't understand was that racism existed at a very subtle level. We've got to Aotearoa New Zealand now where racism exists at an overt level, and you can actually pick up Islamophobia on a day-to-day basis. That's happening right here in this country. What we need to do is empower people to understand what Islamophobia is. What we need to do is empower people to have access to accurate knowledge that jihad is not a bad word, that Sharia is not a bad word, that theology is very different to cultural practices, and we need to understand theology in the context of the culture and the land that we live in. This is where I go back to the point I made first and foremost about my own identity. Some of us who have been raised in the West have had the absolute privilege of actually looking at our faith in a way that allows us to see it outside of the context of the culture. And that is really important to be able to talk about Islam, its theology, its practices, and to be able to critique it. So I don't think there's a problem with feeling the word jihad. I think there's a problem with us collectively empowering people to be able to embrace these words again, reclaim them, and then go out there and share them widely.
There's a heap of stuff there. Thank you for that. Tayyaba, I'm fully with you. I'm thinking, you just take the word jihad. Brother Farid Ahmed, who many people know, who's currently in hospital, bless him, so we make dua for his well-being. I've asked him on a couple of occasions, I said, would it be fair to say that you carry out jihad every single day? And he said, yes, certainly, meaning that inner striving against every negative tendency, debasing tendency that's there in us as human beings. The idea of the Sharia, whose root I understand to be the same root as the path to the water. So the essence of the Sharia is about everything that is life affirming, the idea of honor, the idea of right of progeny, these things. I would love to see our khatib, our imams, say on the Friday prayer, to make that clear, these kind of terms which have been taken from us and been twisted, so that, for example, again, that we are taught that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be with him, was sent only as a rahmatan lil alameen, a mercy and a blessing to all of the world. So that's who we are. That's who we're meant to be. And yet there's a denigration thing. You picked up, Tayyaba, you picked up the whole thing of Bilal and race. And when you said that, I was thinking of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X had the name, he gave himself the name X, and the white guys in the States were interviewing him and said, what's your real name? Because he was brought up as Malcolm Little. And he said, Little is not my name. Little is the slave owner's name that was given to my forebears. My own name was Lost. And his experience growing up in a deeply racist USA was then completely changed when he went on the Hajj to Mecca. He wrote his letter from Mecca, where he said that he had been embraced by people who would have been classified or categorized as white in his own country. I've been offered accommodation, given accommodation by them, and so on and so forth, and honored and accepted as a human. There was a man called Eldridge Cleaver, member of the Black Power movement, who wrote about this, and he said that that example that Malcolm X experienced of the way to live together, he said, I have, so to speak, washed my hands in the blood of the martyr Malcolm X, whose retreat from the precipice of madness created a small space for us to turn around in, and I'm caught up in that tiny space attempting a maneuver of my own, meaning the precipice of madness, meaning racial hatred. And that's what pure Islam gave him, because the Prophet, peace be with him, in his farewell khutbah, we all know, said there is no priority over an Arab over a non-Arab, over a black over a white, or a white over a black. That's what we're meant to be, and we must ensure that we don't get caught up in this communitarian kind of division. We all line up together and so on. So that must be a conscious thing. It's comfortable. It's comfortable. In our community, we have 45 to 50 different nationalities in our small masjid. And some of them like spicy food. My dear respected late brother, Abdul Fattah, who was killed on March 15, I remember him always he was horrified by people putting milk in their tea. Always refused, it just isn't right at all. We have our differences. We're taught that the difference is a blessing. So that message of what we're about, we have to own. And coming back to New Zealand, the writer Joe Bennett, who lives over the hill here in Littleton, one of his books is a book called A Land of Two Halves. He's talking about hitchhiking around New Zealand. And somewhere toward the end of the book, or certainly near the end of the book, he reflects on hitchhiking around the South Island and the North Island. He remembers how he's been picked up by all kinds of people, given rides. And that included up in the North Island and right up in the north, Maori, Pacifica people. And he wondered what would happen if it had been a Maori guy who was hitching. Would he have got the same kind of treatment? So we had, after March 15, Tusiata Avia, Samoan poet, Pacifica poet, and she picked up this whole thing of this is not us. And she said, you say he is not us, but she said, I grew up with him. I grew up with him in school. He was this guy who was the skinhead. He wore Nazi gear, and we said it was cool. So our experiences, even in these wonderful islands here, do invite greater reflection. So something of, again, taking control over your own story. To look also, to be fair to what an example from the Jewish community, Steven Spielberg, after he made Schindler's List, organized people to develop what they call the Visual History Foundation, trained interviewers in different languages, and interviewed, I think, in excess of 50,000 people in their own languages, whether that be Portuguese or Dutch or Norwegian or whatever it was, the experience of people who were survivors of the Shoah, the Holocaust. Digitized that record. I think that in at least one place they've done hologram recordings of a survivor, and then you've got a whole database of questions, so that when that person passes on, questions can be asked which were not originally asked, but you have that person talking their experience. Really well-funded exercise in recording the social history of Jewish people as human beings. We don't do that. You're far more likely, it seems to me, to have some wealthy Muslim sort of pay for Beyonce or something to come for their party. What do we do as a community? Okay, that's beyond me. What do we do as individuals? And finding different ways of telling your own story, and making sure that these terms, recognizing when a term has been abused, like the Sharia, like jihad, and challenging them. And if we're not in a position, because I'm not a scholar, but then we press our scholars, challenge this, or we go to find places where that scholarship exists, so that you can point people in that direction. Look, see this. So,
Fatima, if it is okay, I'm just going to jump in because this conversation is blossoming so beautifully. And as someone who studies dialogue for my scholarship, here's my question for you, Tayyaba and Anthony, which is that, I love how you talk about binaries and needing to move beyond binaries to build really that invitational space, if you will, for dialogue. At the same time, Tayyaba, when you talk about sort of deeply violent colonial history, and that colonial history playing out in the contemporary context of an unfolding genocide as it is operationalized by international legal experts. The question is, how does one really talk about dialogue or this idea of moving beyond binaries while at the same time recognizing the materiality of the colonial violence and the underlying white supremacy really that propels that violence that is at play here?
Oh, gosh, Dr. Mohan, you've really taken our conversation to the very, very next level. Thank you so much for that question. Look, I'm also not a scholar, and so I guess I will answer this in very simplistic terms, in terms of how I see the world around me, or how I see my world at the moment. And I've come to a point where I feel like, unfortunately, even dialogue platforms, initiatives that we did create, to some extent, have been hijacked. They've been created with an inauthenticity where we haven't had the equity we would have needed for genuine dialogue to happen when we find ourselves in positions like the one that we are in today when it comes to the genocide in Gaza. And so then we're in this kind of strange scenario where people we would have shared spaces with to be able to have a conversation, across religions, we're struggling to do that. We're literally avoiding each other because there's this massive discomfort about the elephant in the room. So I think for me, there is this almost grief, actually, of realizing that there has been an inauthenticity to the kaupapa that we committed to, particularly in the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, after 9/11, when the interfaith movement, anyway, really sort of took off. And some of us didn't quite see whether there was equity of voice, equity of space, authenticity, and genuine relationships to fall back on when things got really difficult. And we're seeing that work and its foundational strength now, and whether it even existed. So there's grief there for me. But look, in that grief is always the opportunity as well, right? Because you learn that things need to happen differently. And so I think now is our opportunity, with those very movements that were established in the post 9/11 context, and in Aotearoa anyway, where we actually really go, okay, we need to have some honest, free, frank, safe conversations across the binaries. We might not agree, but we've now got 2 decades of experience to know whether we can hear each other across the divide. And within that, I think we might find a new, innovative way of having dialogue. Maybe, I don't know. But I think that's what's now needed. Because, I think a part of me is definitely grieving that what we were doing after 9/11, in terms of bringing religious communities, anyway, together to be able to understand each other better, to be more tolerant, to be more understanding. even within that, there was a level of inequity created. And we're seeing the result of it now, where people struggle to call a genocide, where people are struggling to see the humanization of a group of people and actually speak about it. And there's no fundamental failure to that. That is a big failure when people struggle to actually see the violence that's happening in front of our eyes and call it that. And we're stuck on this very small, but October 7th happened. I know there were lives lost, but there have been numerous lives lost, and we have not acknowledged the loss of those lives. So this is about equity, and this is about authenticity, and this is our call now to rise up to that equity and authenticity.
Beautiful.
I'm picking up on, sorry.
Go ahead, Anthony.
Karen Armstrong, when she launched a TED Talk, she launched the Charter for Compassion. She said that the thing about our religious leaders is that they're more intent on being right than on being compassionate. We hold on to labels as a defense mechanism, it seems, almost. So there are words that we say, well, you cannot use this because this label only applies to us, because the scale of what happened has never been equaled. The words that block, I mean, pulling away the garbage that's in the way. So like the word like terrorism as a label, because if I come to somebody like Robert Fisk, the late Robert Fisk, who lived for many years in the Middle East and saw up close the effects of war on the human bodies, in his book Pity the Nation, Lebanon at War, big thick book, important book for politicians to read if you're going to be talking about the use of the word terrorism and terrorist, because you wonder too what politicians read, or whether they've got time to read, for goodness sake. And he talks about 1982 or thereof, and the bombardment of southern Lebanon and of Beirut, and he cites a particular Lebanese doctor who the effects of white phosphorus on the human flesh. So the dead bodies of children, all she can do because of the white phosphorus is to put the bodies into water, submerge them into water. And when she pulls them out, they're still smoldering. And you wonder, what on earth would the effect be on a mother who witnessed her child? So when you talk about terrorism, it's terror, and the making of terror and the sowing of terror on others. And Fisk is strong and scathing about this. He and Terry Anderson, who was an Associate Press journalist who was captured and held hostage by the Shia Hezbollah for 6 years. I'll read something from this. He said, "What's in a name? Not long before he was kidnapped, he may have felt very differently in the moments that followed. I remember Terry Anderson giving an instruction to his staff in Beirut. Don't use the word terrorist," he said. "It's pejorative out here." And then Fisk goes on to say, but terrorism no longer means terrorism. It is not a definition. It is a political contrivance. Terrorists are those who use violence against the side that is using the word. The only terrorist Israel acknowledges are those who oppose Israel. The only terrorist the United States acknowledges are those who oppose the United States or their allies. The only terrorist Palestinians acknowledge are those opposed to the Palestinians. And then you pick up on somebody like Walter Cronkite, speaking to Dan Rather, and they were profoundly respected US journalists, but they recalled the use of B-52 bombers in Vietnam and Cronkite said, you've seen the B-52s in operation in Vietnam. I have, and they are almost a terror weapon. They are so powerful. So we've got to clear away a lot of garbage around this, which is protective, which stops proper conversation taking place. I wonder how much terror a child feels in Gaza, undergoing operation without anesthetic, and possibly after having lost nearly every member of their family. I wonder what terror a mother, wherever that mother is, a mother who's lost her child, and then we compound it with a mother who's born a child for 9 months and then possibly doesn't have the milk to feed the child. Terror is a consequence of the incredible ability of humankind, almost inexhaustible capacity to generate more and worse and more invidious kind of ways of tormenting other humans. So when we're having a conversation, then let's have the conversation in a bit more, in a greater preparedness to be self-critical. Thinking here of the Canadian anthropologist, whose name is escaping me at the moment, who said that other people are not failed attempts at being us. So the vantage points that any of us can take towards others need to be examined. The ability to be self-critical and so on. So much to pull away, much to tear away before we can get to a decent point, and a far greater honesty about the way that we discuss issues.
It's beautiful how you keep coming back to the concept or idea of authenticity, because there is so much to hold there. I will say this, with my work on Hindutva, for instance, and looking at Islamophobia in Hindutva, the thing that surprised me quite a bit when engaging that interfaith context was how unwilling the dominant interfaith space, and I theorize about this as the whiteness of the space in terms of the norms of civility that sort of uphold that whiteness, that was unwilling to have that honest conversation about the presence of Hindutva in interfaith spaces. In the same way, I think there also needs to be a space for conversing about the Islamophobia that comes from far-right Zionism, and how then that is both mainstreamed and whitewashed through interfaith spaces, then which does two things. On one hand, it whitewashes far-right Zionism, and on the other hand, it continues to give it a platform so that it can turn around and say that, look, I'm not Islamophobic. I'm, after all, having these beautiful conversations with Muslims in beautiful ceremonies, almost this performative dimension. So I guess the question there is that how do you decolonize those logics and norms of whiteness that actually silence and erase the difficult conversations on one hand, and on the other hand continue to whitewash and amplify those deeply Islamophobic movements that find their foothold within interfaith conversations and spaces,
But before anyone answers that question, I'd also like to add that what Mohan is saying also leads to internalization within the Muslim community, acceptance of that dominant narrative, not just in other communities, but within Muslim communities, and taking it back to decolonization and that fear that we started with, if we can link it back to that too. Thank you.
I mean, I think it's all linked, and thank you for joining us, Professor Mohan. I imagine you're quite busy, but I think this just adds a deeper level of how interconnected various issues that we're seeing actually are. And speaking of the interfaith movement, it takes me back to, when we were at the height of building the interfaith movement here, there were people back then who were highlighting, the concerns around the Hindutva movements here and so forth. And the issue, and this becomes the issue of solidarity, which is what we're talking about today, is that we have not learned to hold space for people who raise concerns and who raise critique. We don't have the culture and the appetite for that here in Aotearoa, and that's the muscle we must build. We must build it if we want freedom for all, if we want equality for all, if we want democracy. That is what we must build. And we've been failing at that. So we almost kind of we ostracize, outcast people who say things that just don't seem to fit the mainstream mold. And we've done that in the interfaith movement. I know that exists. I've been a witness to it. And so it is about how do we now build a society and build a community that can hold people and space for people when they're raising the difficult issues for us. Those people are still in our communities today, but they're not participating anymore because they're burnt out. We traumatized them, we ostracized them, we took away their resources for saying the important things that we're now dealing with, but at a much heightened level, when we could have avoided that if we were hearing them 15 years ago, for example, but we didn't do that. So we now have a bigger problem. And so I think for me, the solution lies in how do we create spaces for people who have been saying these things to us for a long time? How do we reintegrate them back into communities that really need their knowledge and expertise and their guidance to rebuild and re-strengthen ourselves as communities who can tackle multiple issues on multiple fronts that have the same agenda, whether that's Hindutva, whether that's Zionism, whether that's racism in terms of whiteness and brownness and blackness. They're all interconnected.
I'm wondering, because our starting point was, and while all the time that we have been talking in the comfort and the safety of our rooms, there are people who are living in utter misery in a landscape which has been scarred, where universities and hospitals and schools and houses and everything have been destroyed, where means of growing crops have been destroyed. All this is going on still while we talk. And when we end this conversation, that task remains that if we can do nothing for this right now, today, what do we do in terms of, we come right back to our circles of influence, and as Tayyaba said earlier on, starting with ourselves, what can we do to say, okay, I carry forward that consciousness of, well, because we talk about brothers and sisters. In somewhere in the UN, there is a piece of embroidery from the poem of Saadi from Shiraz called Bani Adam, that basically you are all Bani Adam, you are all children of Adam. And that if one part, and you can see this in the poetry of John Donne in England, but if something happens, we're all part of one body, and if something happens to one part of that body and you are not affected, and it doesn't hurt you, and it doesn't affect you in any way, then you have ceased to be part of Bani Adam. And that's a real thing. I was told by an Iranian that in Iran, kids have little lines from Saadi's poetry, and they sort of sell it at traffic lights. In the coroner's court here in Christchurch, one of our community, Mirwais Waziri, when the coroner mentioned the name of the Christchurch killer, he stood up and objected and said that name should not be mentioned, because Mirwais, I think, was coming from that perspective. He has ceased to be Bani Adam. In a sense, he's renounced his right to be a part of humanity in that sense by his actions. And you look then at the idea in Te Ao Māori of mana, those fundamental concepts about the humanity that should exist in us. So what do we carry forward, and what can we personally act on? And I would love to see at each Friday sermon people being able to go away from the sermon with a reminder of this is who you are. Whatever, there's a wonderful, powerful scene in the movie Kingdom of Heaven where Salahuddin is accepting the surrender of Jerusalem, and by goodness knows, I am not in any way putting us as on his level, but he offers terms to say all of your people get safe passage away. And the Crusader says, we did not do this, we slaughtered. And he said, I am not those men, I am Salahuddin. So to be able to stand up, and I've said this about Brother Farid in Christchurch, I said to people countless times, I said, you can agree with Farid or you can disagree, that's your privilege. And I've told him that I've said this. I said, but don't tell me that you don't know what he stands for. Don't tell me you don't know what he stands for, because he's consistent in it. You can disagree with him, that's fine. So to actually know what on earth it does mean, it's not being part of the Muslim community is not membership of some club, for goodness sake. You know, it's a profound definition and description of what it means to be a human being in this world with all of your responsibilities towards every created being. The anthropologist, by the way, his name was Wade Davis. I just remembered another Canadian anthropologist. Yeah, and not to take comfort in our teachings, because I hear sometimes there's a verse in the Quran that says we have made you the best of nations, and people almost live with that and walk up, we're number one, but there's a little bit tacked on that, and it's the qualifier, and it says you enjoin the good and you forbid the bad, and you can only be the best of nations if that is what you do. You being like a conscience to yourself first. And one of the very first phrases I heard that's really stuck with me, and this is before I made the Shahada for Islam. I was in a talk and this guy said, I remind myself and you. So before we start judging anyone, before we start making pronouncements, that teaching to remind ourselves of what we are, and I know every day I fall short. I know that. But this reclaiming something which has been taken from us and used against us, and the description of who we are, which is an unjust thing. That's, to me, that's part of the mahi. I think that's probably enough from me.
Thank you. Tayyaba, do you have any concluding remarks before, or Mohan, did you have another question?
Okay, yeah, I do. I think just in summation, going back to, I suppose, what we're talking about, right? And I just want to talk about what Brother Anthony just said around us looking at ourselves first. You know, the Quran, actually, when you read it, it is talking to us. Even in when Allah is talking about other communities, He's actually talking to us in terms of looking at ourselves and not being hypocrites and not being arrogant and not thinking that we are the best, because He has sent communities before and He's sent messengers to those communities before who did the same thing. So actually for us, if we were really, looking at our faith, we would realize that there is lessons in that for us. They apply to us. We cannot hold a place of superiority. In fact, if we're really steeped in our iman, then we're so focused and constantly being in fear of the fact that we want to please Allah and be best in the eyes of Allah, and you would not have time to focus on anyone else and, nitpicking and all of this other stuff that you see in the community. And that is then closely linked to the second thing, which I think is important for solidarity: decolonizing your mind, recognizing that you've actually now gone through a process of violence, of mainstream media narratives, of shaping of your identity by the other and by the society that's meant that you're at times embarrassed to even admit that you're Muslim. So actually changing that and decolonizing that and embracing your spiritual identity so that you're able to then do justice in the outside world in terms of, whatever is happening. Nothing annoys me more than what I see now, which is something major happens and people jump on social media and then they try and popularize themselves, but actually they've had no sort of background knowledge, context, and even genuine relationships with people who have been affected to get to that point. So, learn your faith, decolonize your mind, and then actually take some action, but take that action with people. Get off the internet, get off the social media apps, and actually do the doing in the real world, because that's what's needed. And I think if we're doing solidarity in that way, then hopefully we're making our way forward. And last but not least, sorry, just because I am so steeped in the Palestinian solidarity work right now, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Use your money well, ethically. This doesn't just apply to the Palestinians. How you use your money would apply to changing lives for the Congolese or the Sudanese, or in our faith we have the zakat, we have the sadaqah. We actually have principles that encourage us to, on a daily basis, be contributing to someone else's life financially. Pick those practices up, but pick up the fact that you want to spend each dollar ethically, so that you are not harming someone else's life consciously or unconsciously. Start to really equip yourself with the knowledge that you want to spend your money well. And that would be my concluding remarks. Thank you.
I think we circled back to Ikra very well, in the sense that, learn where you're spending your money, learn about your faith, learn about reclaiming language, reclaiming identity, and then that authenticity of, trying to be yourself. These are big words and very difficult tasks, if I may say so, because it's a struggle every day to stick to it. But this is something that we can do in our capacity, and we think that these things are not big enough, and what difference does it make? But it actually does if we try our best to do it every day. That's what I've learned from this conversation, from you guys. Thank you so much for taking out the time. I'm going to hand it to Mohan, because I'm grateful that Professor Mohan has provided us the space to have this open conversation, to be honest, because, as Tayyaba was alluding to, that we often don't get spaces where we can talk about these things without fearing, or without the apprehension of what I'm saying, how will it be used, but just being open about it. So back to you, Mohan.
Namihi, Assalamu alaikum, and so beautiful to listen to your Correro in such an engaging and transformative way. One of the things that I walk away with from this conversation is your invitation to decolonize, and that to me is as much a journey of the self as it is a critique of the structures. It is also beautiful to hear you talk about how you build spaces for the other and recognizing the other through faith journeys, right? And I suppose, the transformative part of that in some ways is, as both you, Tayyaba, and Brother Anthony have pointed out, how do we hold the space for Palestinian voices that are bearing the pain and bearing witness to the pain, and create the infrastructures for voices to be heard. For us at CARE, that is an ongoing challenge, because I think, as each of you point to, it is an ongoing struggle to build and sustain spaces at the margins, particularly so because there are so many structural impediments to having those authentic conversations. So if I were to summarize this Correro, I come back to this notion of authenticity and what does it mean to listen authentically. I love how you talked about how that actually transforms into moving beyond our digital spheres and looking at, and I love that you complicated the notion of community leader, and at the same time, the invitation that you offer is to turn to community, a physical sense of community, noting, of course, that community is not homogeneous, that it is the difference and diversity within community that makes it community. But at the same time, engage in that work of finding and holding community and being in community. And Fatima, when we were planning this event, we talked about what does it mean to be on the streets in solidarity with the Palestinian protests. Here in Manawatu in Palmy, the protests are on Saturday afternoons. And there's so many friends that I've talked to say that, hey, I want to be at the protest, but I feel scared to be at the protest. So part of that recognition also is recognizing that there are challenges sometimes to us being in that physical community. So, I take away from this conversation, particularly in this the holy spirit of Ramadan, this idea that how do we take away those barriers collectively that create fear, that impede us, that create all these negative emotions when we want to be in communities, so that we can be free, right, in finding and connecting and building our community. So, namaskar, salam alaikum, and so grateful for this conversation.